welcome to this evening's lecture. I'm going to switch my thing there. Okay. So welcome to this evening's lecture, Normalizing Hate Against Jews. And we welcome Christians United for Israel, Kasim Hafeez, to tonight's lecture. No doubt all of us have been following the events, and we followed the 10 days or 11 days of the recent conflict in Israel between the Israeli military and Hamas, launching over 4,000 rockets out of Gaza. But then we've also watched an influx or a wave of global anti-Semitism, and it seems to be different. Some things seem to have changed. We've seen anti-Semitism, I mean, technically for over 17 centuries, even beyond that. And in the history of the modern state of Israel, we've seen anti-Semitism shift and change and slightly adapt from anti-Semitism we see earlier in history. But this is troubling the Jewish community globally. It's troubling Friends of Israel globally. It's troubling governments and all kinds of people of conscience, different faith groups, of what is going on. And I believe there's also a lot of people in the midst trying to kind of look at both sides, trying to figure out why these things are happening and identifying it. And there's a lot of saber rattling, there's a lot of noise. And but what we see is anti-Semitism becoming bolder, I believe, becoming clearer. It seems to be getting uglier. And in a Canadian context, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks are abuse right on the streets, verbally, physically. We've seen flag burnings, we've seen all kinds of things. And we do know that the Jewish community of Canada, many people within it are feeling unsafe. And there's questions, even in other countries like the UK, France, the United States, there's questions about safety, the safety of the Jewish community. There's questions about how to respond. There's questions about hate crimes, prosecuting, all kinds of things. And so we have invited Kasim Hafeez to speak into this, because from the one side, they'll say, oh, we're not being anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Israel or anti-Zionist. But then when you look at the track record, you look at the words, you look at the associations and these things, it certainly doesn't seem that way. And it's very polarizing and very aggressive. And so people of conscience, people of morality, people of ethics, people standing against these forms of hate, we need to be able to identify it, understand it, and take action and be informed, I think is very important. And Kasim is going to be bringing that to us tonight. So after that, kind of the regaling to you about what you're going to experience through tonight, I'd like to formally introduce myself. My name is Reverend Peter Fast. I'm the National Director of Bridges for Peace Canada. Bridges for Peace, we are Christians supporting Israel and building relationships between Christians and Jews in Israel and around the world. And we partner with the Jewish community in the 8 nations that we have national offices in. And so the national office in Canada is right here in Winnipeg, and we work with the Canadian Jewish community, but we also stand with the people and nation of Israel. And we have some incredible programs. We're feeding over 22,000 needy Israelis every month, Jew and Arab. We have Feed a Child programs, home repair programs. We do hospital visitations. We work with children in schools and municipalities, mayors, right from the government into the Orthodox Jewish religious world to the secular world. It is an incredible work that we do as we build bonds between the Christian world and the Jewish world and strengthen our relationship through reconciliation. And one of the major forms of action that we do take is against anti-Semitism. We also educate the church on the Hebraic roots of Christianity, on the importance of Israel in the Bible, on the importance of Israel today, biblical prophecy, all of these things. But we also will speak on issues, sometimes very sensitive issues like Christian anti-Semitism in history and even today, or secular anti-Semitism as well. And so we seek to be a friend of the Jewish community, to build deep relationships with the Jewish community, and that also entails standing against publicly and shoulder to shoulder against anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and anti-Israel rhetoric. And so tonight, this lecture is very important. We've hosted Kasim Hafeez on past events that we've done, and it is an honor to host him tonight. It is also an honor to work with Yolanda, and you're going to hear a little bit more about Winnipeg Friends of Israel, but we've worked with Winnipeg Friends of Israel before, and once again, it is just an honor to continue our important work as a grassroots organizations and reach out and connect with you tonight, joining us. So without further ado, I'd like to share a short video about Bridges for Peace, and then we will turn things over to Yolanda.
Bridges for Peace. Christians supporting Israel and building relationships between Christians and Jews in Israel and around the world. Bridges for Peace, 50 years of blessing Israel and the church through compassion and revelation. Compassion. Feeding Israel's hungry. Caring for Israel's needy. Repairing homes. Giving hope to children in poverty. Helping the Jewish people return to their ancient homeland. Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Revelation, bringing the Bible to life in its ancient context, revealing the truth of Israel's prophetic significance, telling the story of Israel's miraculous rebirth, connecting Christians and the Jewish people through a grassroots global team of Christian representatives. For God's instruction shall go forth from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Bridges for Peace, a Matthew 25 ministry dedicated to supporting the nation of Israel and bridging the centuries-old gap between Christians and Jews. Bridges for Peace, your Israel connection.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many of you with us tonight. I want to just say something short about Winnipeg Friend of Israel. We established Winnipeg Friends of Israel in 2014 during Operation Protective Edge, and we established because of much frustration with biased mainstream media. We consist of individuals who care deeply about Israel and aim to challenge delegitimation and dehumanization of Israel and her people through education. Over the years, we partnered with Zionist groups to bring forth valuable information to the public and to reach out to other communities. We brought experts to talk about pressing issues. We reached out to other communities through projects such as the Double Mitzvah Project and Operation Ezra, which we founded and which resulted in bringing Yazidi refugees to Winnipeg. We're proud of our achievements, especially since our work is done by volunteers and with very little funds. I want to take this opportunity to thank each and one of you for the support that you lended us during the years. And we hope that we'll be able to continue to share our life to Israel with you. And special thanks to our dedicated board. Like Peter said, we are very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada and around the world. The last few weeks felt like all masks were removed and anti-Semitism is once again raising its ugly head, proudly and openly. Worse, we're being told that what we see is not anti-Semitism. Are we being gaslighted? Is anti-Semitism the new normal? If yes, what can we do about it? We asked Kasim Hafeez to help us answer some of these questions and shed light on the recent events from his point of view. Kasim is not a stranger to us. He's been with us since the beginning. He's a friend of Winnipeg Friends of Israel. He spoke to our group on numerous occasions. He was born in Britain to a Pakistani Muslim family. As a child, he was exposed to radical anti-Western, anti-Semitic, and anti-Israel ideas on a daily basis. During his teenage years, Kasim embraced the radical Islamist ideology and became very active in the anti-Israel movement. You probably know, but I'll mention it anyways, Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, challenged Kasim's fundamental beliefs and led him to Israel in 2007, where he witnessed Israel for himself and changed his perception on the country and the Jewish people. He gradually turned into an advocate for Israel and a frontrunner in the war against anti-Semitism. Since we saw Kasim at our farewell party, he got married. So congratulations, Kasim, Mazal Tov to you. And he landed a position with Christian United for Israel, or CUFI, as a Middle Eastern analyst. And he has been working tirelessly to combat hate against Israel and her people. We are very excited to have Kasim here tonight and listen to what he has to say. So Kasim, you can turn on the camera.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for the introduction, and it's always good to be here with Winnipeg Friends of Israel. I remember when you guys started, and wow, it's incredible the work you've done in such a short space of time.
Thank you, Kasim, and thank you for your support. I'll turn off my camera so we can see you and we'll listen to you, and then Peter will facilitate the question and answers. And thanks for your presentation. Thank you.
No, you're very welcome. So the topic that I'm discussing is normalizing hate against Jews. And as some of you who may have heard my background, so I grew up in the UK to a Muslim family, and on the whole, my family weren't extreme or radical, but anti-Semitism was very prevalent in my family and my community. And that led me down a path where I was incredibly anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and almost became a terrorist. Thankfully, things changed. I ended up going to Israel, and that really changed my perspectives. And today, I work for Christians United for Israel and spent the last decade of my life fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bigotry. So I have a number of insights into Jew hatred today. One, from my own background. Two, from work I've done in social media. And three, from this strange hybrid anti-Semitism, which it almost crosses all ideological lines. It's bizarre. So I'm going to kind of address them all separately. So in terms of my background, look, I don't think it's inflammatory to say, or it's inaccurate to say. And I base this on experiences that I still have when I speak on campuses or speak out on social media. Unfortunately, there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world and in Muslim communities. Where does that come from? For example, one of the most, especially online in the last conflict, one of the most hostile in terms of where this hate is coming from towards Israel was people from Pakistan, where my family are from. Pakistan has no direct borders with Israel. It has no direct conflict with Israel. It has no real quarrel based on the normal parameters of a conflict, borders, or anything like this. Yet it has been dragged into this conflict. I say dragged like it was forced, but it has chosen to engage in this conflict in the name of Islamic solidarity. So for much of the Muslim world, and it's really interesting because a lot of the hate, when we looked at it in this last conflict, came from Pakistan and Malaysia, countries which aren't even in the Middle East. And when you Juxtapose that with what is happening in the Middle East, in the UAE and Bahrain, where they are, just reaching out and making alliances to support the region and reaching out to Israel and forming, diplomatic relations. It's really strange. But we have to break this down. Where does this come from? In Pakistan's case, it has to do with the search for an identity. Similar to Turkey, where, look, nobody can deny, and there are different interpretations and different applications, but there are aspects of anti-Semitism within Islam, within the Quran, within what Muhammad said. You can't deny that. And there are people who propagate this myth that prior to the rebirth of Israel in 1948, the Jewish communities lived fine and happily and with greater rights in the Middle East, in the Arab Muslim world. Now, this is true to an extent, because when you compare what was happening to Jews in Europe with the Holocaust and these horrific things that are happening, not being murdered was being treated better in the Arab Muslim world. Like, that's a reality. It wasn't they were treated equally. That's simply historically not true. But again, these historical myths become reality and are propagated. So you have this idea which permeates much Islamic scripture of the Jews being weak, the Jews being the murderers of prophets, etc., etc. And that has continued and almost been nuclearized with the rebirth of the state of Israel, where you have a people who are described as weak and cowardly, and somehow miraculously in 1948, they survived this Arab onslaught. In 67, they do it again. In 73, they do it again. And, it adds this fuel to the fire, and you see almost a progression where in that space of time, the hatred against Israel has increased. And that also has to do with countries have realized that they can't beat Israel. They can't beat Israel militarily. So how do you do it? And now, here's the thing that's important to remember. Criticism of Israel, and I hate saying this because it's an absurd statement. Criticism of Israel is valid. Okay, it is. Like criticism of any country, America, Canada, wherever. Like, I am incredibly patriotic towards both Canada and America, strangely so. But criticism is valid. But when we talk about criticism of Israel, it's not criticism of Israeli policy. When I talk about Canada, we go, okay, the residential school system was atrocious. Canada needs to, make amends for that. But when we talk about criticism of Israel that we see, it is this blanket criticism of Israel's right to exist. Israel is not given the right to defend itself. Israel is not allowed to exist, essentially. And you have these buzzwords such as apartheid, genocide, the worst words. And it's so unique that these are only used towards Israel. Now, and this is where it kind of intersects with, a lot of these modern social justice movements. So you have on the one hand, this anti-Semitism, which comes from the Muslim world, which is to do with theology. It has to do with politics and Israel's very existence. And then you get to the Western world. Now, there's a number of aspects that I want to talk to from my own perspective. I genuinely believe, and I've been saying this for a long time, that in Europe, anti-Semitism never disappeared. I don't think it did. I believe that post-Holocaust, the world was so shocked by the evil, by what that hatred, what that Jew hatred manifested, that it became something that was off limits. Anti-Semitism went underground. It didn't disappear. And then what you saw happen was two things. One, I'm going to be very direct. Unfortunately, the world, be it America, be it Europe, so many of the world is more comfortable mourning dead Jews than they are supporting Jews who defend themselves. That's a reality. So what you have happen is Israel defends itself in 67 and is no longer the weak Jewish state, which is on the verge of elimination at any point. When Israel was this weak state, which was struggling with refugees who had come from all over the Middle East, Jewish refugees escaping persecution, and Holocaust survivors. Israel, people forget that Israel had rationing during its early years when it was this weak state with no economy, which was, fighting a war essentially from its very rebirth up until, now, but against Jordan and Syria. Israel was perceived as weak. Many commentators didn't think Israel would last or would exist today. In that scenario, many people felt sympathetic. Again, there is this mentality that weak Jews, we can be sympathetic to. But when Israel showed that it was able to defend itself, that it didn't need to look to the world, essentially, one of the cornerstones of Israel's foundation is that Jewish people need a homeland and they need to be able to defend themselves because the world doesn't care. So you have this scenario, and then you have essentially too new immigrant communities come into Europe, from North Africa and France, from Turkey and Germany, in the UK, from Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. And you start to hear those old slogans, anti-Semitic comments. You start to hear, whenever Israel defends itself, the same anti-Semitic language which was in Europe. And rather than reject that, rather than go, this is evil, that same anti-Semitism, other people jumped on board because there's a perception which exists, and I think it exists all over the Western world, where it's seen, and I'm sure many of you in the Jewish community have probably seen this. There are people who will make anti-Semitic comments and justify it with, well, I have a friend who's Jewish who also hates Israel. Or, if I say something, people will think twice before accusing me of anti-Semitism. It's a double standard. And I think based on that double standard, many Europeans embraced anti-Semitism, and it joined in this weird intersect where you see radical Islamists who are anti-Semitic, and then you have people who are on the left on the political spectrum, and they have this strange alliance, which makes no sense. And the only thing they agree on is hating Israel and the Jews. And also now you see it with the extreme right, who have always been anti-Semitic. They have their own anti-Semitism steeped in Nazi ideology. So look, why has this become so widespread? It has to do with a number of things. One is it's been a drip, and it's been in our education systems, it's been in books we've read, it's been in the media, and now with social media, it's more apparent. Honestly, that's what it is. Because every time somebody makes a claim, somebody famous or well-known or with millions of followers talks about anti-Semitism, talks about Israel, it is never from this, they talk about Israel in a way that they would never talk about another country. Just to give you an example, in the last 2 weeks, you had celebrities sharing this graphic talking about the rights of the Palestinians, and you can't remain silent, and you can't pick and choose which causes that you fight for. Okay, this was the graphic. I don't have it in front of me right now, so let's unpack that. Okay, the Palestinians are suffering 100%. I don't disagree with that. Israel's not responsible, though. Israel is not responsible for what happening in Gaza with Hamas. They dug up the water pipes for their own people to fire rockets at Israel. The West Bank, most of the population is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Israel is not responsible for that suffering either. There's a conflict, there are problems. Nobody's denying that. But there is this dogmatic approach that what's happening in Palestine to the Palestinians is because of Israel. And then that gets nuclearized into these buzzwords of apartheid, genocide, you name it. Look, if anybody does the research, you cannot accuse Israel of apartheid. Genuinely, literally 2 weeks ago, a week ago, I was asked to look through a video which a very popular Middle Eastern media outlet produced accusing Israel of apartheid. It's full of half-truths and half-facts, yet it's been viewed probably millions of times now, And those lies are propagated. Again, look, these media outlets aren't unbiased. And then we look at genocide. This is the worst genocide in human history, where the numbers of the Palestinians have gone up rather than down. The genocide means to destroy a population and a culture and a group. It's not happening. And as I was talking about this meme that these celebrities put out, they're not even living by their own convictions. Are they talking about Darfur? Like, that's still happening. Are they talking about Syria? Still happening. Are they talking about the conflict in Ethiopia and Eritrea? Happening right now. Are they talking about Yemen? Still happening. So when there is this focus purely on Israel, the Jewish state, something's off. It doesn't make sense when people who are completely unengaged in all the conflicts that are happening, when horrific things are happening right now in so many countries, and their only focus at Israel, you have to ask why. And I sincerely believe it comes down to one simple point. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There's no ifs, there's no buts. I don't care who disagrees with me. You are 100% wrong. I don't care if your best friend who's Jewish and a rabbi disagrees. You're wrong. It's simple as that. Because, and look, I'm not a person who wants to go, this is what anti-Semitism is, as somebody who's non-Jewish. It is not my place, but this is something which is a fact. This isn't my opinion. This is a verifiable fact. And I say it based on this. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, okay, in the simplest terms. It is a historic longing of the Jewish people to return to their homeland. It predates Theodor Herzl. It just was the founder of modern political Zionism. So when you say I am anti-Zionist, you are saying I am directly opposed to national sovereignty for the Jewish people. I'm directly opposed to this one group, the Jews, having national sovereignty in their homeland, having freedom, independence, and being able to determine their own future. In that instance, you're singling out one group, the Jews. That is textbook anti-Semitism, when you treat the Jewish people completely different from everyone else. And that's essentially what we have today, because these activists, while they use anti-Zionism as their cloak, ultimately it's anti-Semitism. Because when people see Israel, they see a Jewish state. When people see Israel, they see a Star of David on the flag. When people see Israel, they see the world's only Jewish state. And what do they expect of Jews living in Canada and America and Britain? Well, you have to condemn Israel to be an okay Jew. Like, it's disgusting, it's abhorrent. And, I say this from personal experience. We worked with Jewish activists when I was a radical at college who were Jewish. Did we like them? No. But in that moment, they served a purpose. How can you accuse me of anti-Semitism, even though I am anti-Semitic, and I was, when, I'm here protesting the Jewish state with somebody Jewish? And the fact that this has been allowed into the narrative is hugely problematic, that this somehow justifies it. But I want to dig a little deeper. So the normalization of it has happened because it's entered popular culture. Because look, last year, anti-Semitism hit record highs in the United States. It hit record highs ever recorded. Was there the same level of condemnation of the hate against Asians or systemic racism? No. And that is hugely problematic. Racism should be condemned no matter who it's against, be it anti-Asian, systemic racism, Islamophobia, whatever you want to call it, it has to be condemned. Yet when statistics show that the Jewish community, this tiny community globally, is the biggest recipient of hate crimes in the United States, and I believe in Canada too, there was just not the same outrage. And that's hugely problematic, because right away you're seeing bigotry and discrimination being treated differently when it's a Jewish community. So that's one element of it right away. Let's take Israel out of the equation. Okay, put Israel aside. Jewish communities were attacked in the Western world, highest rate of hate crimes. Nobody seemed to care. Literally, unless you are interested in the field, you work in the field, nobody cared. There wasn't any outrage from companies, sharing a message in support. There wasn't protest. There was nothing. And I get, look, there was COVID, I get that, forget protests. But companies and governments standing up and going, this is abhorrent and we have to fight it. No, there was muted responses. So you're normalizing it. You're going, oh, this is awful, but you're not doing anything about it. And then you have Israel defending itself. Well, let's look at this. Hamas are an organization who are committed to the murder of every Jew, not just Israeli, every Jew. Read their charter. Yet when this organization fires rockets at Israel, trying to murder Jews, that's not what we're concerned with. Not the media, not celebrities, nobody. We're not concerned at active anti-Semitism of an anti-Semitic terror group trying to murder Jews and all Israelis, because they just fire their rockets wherever. We're not concerned with that. We're concerned when Israel responds. The fact that Save Gaza was trending is absurd to me. Because, you know, look, if you want to believe that this all started because of Sheikh Jarrah and all of that, look, that is simply not true. Like, you've got to go deeper into the Palestinian elections and how they were canceled and all these things, but maybe for another time. But if you, let's take that premise that it all started because of Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. Why are Hamas then firing rockets on Gaza? Nothing to do with you. Yet nobody, no media outlet was saying Hamas have started this, and what's Israel meant to do? Because Israel invests millions of dollars into Iron Dome to save its civilians, it's now meant to just not react. And no country would do that. Yet again, Israel, the Jewish state, double standard. You want to talk about conflict? Pakistan. When terror attacks have happened in Pakistan, Pakistan has bombed its own like villages in its own country to kill terrorists, and there is collateral damage. It's awful. Nobody is justifying innocent civilians and children getting killed. It's horrendous. But who's responsible? The terrorists or the country, Israel, who is trying to prevent innocent casualties? But that's how kind of flipped we are when it comes to this. Every outlet, the media, celebrities, even politicians who have no understanding of the ground realities, who make no effort to understand the ground realities, condemn Israel. And that has a knock-on effect because these condemnations happen in the mainstream. When somebody is accusing Israel of apartheid and genocide, it's not a fringe voice anymore. It's people with millions of followers on social media. And I hate social media influencers because I think it's an absurd thing. I don't know what to call it. Profession? It's not a job. I refuse to call it a job. Social media influencers are putting this hate out there in subtle terms, and they're couching it in the language of human rights. And they're then dragging in all these other conflicts. In the United States, they have merged it with the struggle to fight systemic racism. So then you're putting Israel, the Jewish state, in the place of, you know, the racists with apartheid in South Africa. They meld it together. And another thing, let's look at this. There have been many conflicts and actual genocides. Darfur, which is still happening, you know, what happened in the former Yugoslavia, what happened in Syria. How many times have you seen protests happen, or even the media and experts compare the behavior of Assad, Milosevic, you know, Sudan and Darfur to the Nazis? Yet Israel is constantly compared to the Nazis. It's strange, right? Like when you think about it, why is the world's only Jewish state a safe haven for so many people who survived the Holocaust compared to the Nazis? It's intentional. It's not some accident. It's intentionally making, I think it's one, trying to be intentionally hurtful, and two, it's trying to shame Jews who stand with Israel. Look, Israel is integral to the Jewish story. They're inseparable. And again, like, this isn't my opinion, this is just history. And this influencer culture, this celebrity culture, this just the prevalence of social media has given anti-Semitism, master's anti-Zionism, a whole new audience. And again, so I said this when I lived in the UK because I experienced this firsthand. When it comes to extremism, and if you've heard me speak before, I've talked about this, but in a different way. When it comes to extremism, and it can be an extremist group or it can be a gang, it's constantly pushing How far can I push this? Okay, you've joined our gang. Now, will you steal something? Okay, you steal something. How far, how much more can I push this? Will you sell drugs? Okay. Will you now kill somebody? That's what evil does. It keeps pushing until it's stopped. Hitler was the same. He kept pushing, took the Sudeten line. Okay, the world didn't react. Maybe I will just, dismantle the Treaty of Versailles. He kept pushing, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing evil happening, anti-Semitism being tolerated, and nobody acting. Nobody's acting strongly enough. And this has been happening for such a long time. Look, I just want to show you a few things which I brought back from the UK. So these belong to me, okay? These would belong to me. And this is how dangerous and how widespread this messaging has been for years. This is not something we started a year ago or 5 years ago or 4 years ago or 10 years ago. This has been happening for decades. And this is the accumulation of it. This negative education, this anti-Semitism being masked as anti-Zionism, and people allowing it. People have made this excuse that it's fine, that it's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism. They're one and the same. It's honestly that simple. But no, I wanted to show you this. So this is a book which belonged to me. I mean, still belongs to me, I guess. It's from 2001. This was printed in, okay? And I bought this from a bookstore, just a big chain bookstore, okay? It's called Arabs in Israel for Beginners, all right? If you saw this in a bookstore, you'd buy it if you were interested, because you'd see it as being neutral. But then when you go through it, it's really shocking. So this is just chapter 5, okay? Again, this was just at a regular bookstore. I can't think of any Canadian bookstores right now. Chapters, I think. Part 5, chapter 5. These are the headings. Part 5, the world's reaction to the Holocaust. Making Palestine pay for the Holocaust. Zionism's unbelievable reaction to the Holocaust. The United Nations insult to democracy. Ethnic cleansing. The Boy Scout and the Prime Minister. Al-Nakba, the disaster. Don't believe me? It's right there. So this messaging that's been going on, this is 20 years old, this was published. And how many people have read this? How many people who have picked this up with, with just wanting to learn more about the conflict have been getting this sort of messaging? Ultimately, everything stems from education, and this level of hate education has been going on for years, and it's in the mainstream. It's not fringe. All those BDS boycotts about Israel, whether they passed or not, the damage has been done where they have demonized Israel and the Jewish people. It is now a justification. You go on social media, somebody can post about a bar mitzvah, and the question will be, oh, what about Palestine? What does that have to do with it? Look, it's difficult to even say this. The world sees Israel and the Jewish people intrinsically entwined. I mean, that is a reality. By pretending that Israel is something that you're embarrassed of, or it's this separate entity, or whatever you want, it's not going to change that. Of course, look, you're Canadian or American or whatever, but Israel is part of the Jewish story. There's no denying that. And look, again, I have other books that I used to own, which, Arabs in Israel, War or Peace, again, hugely anti-Semitic. It has a picture here and it says, "Oh Jews, what have you done to generate such fury in these mothers?" This book is on the 60s. Oh Jews. It doesn't say oh Israelis, oh Jews. Another one, and this I bought in the UK 2 years ago. So in Islam, the Dajjal is the Antichrist, the emergence of the Dajjal, the Jewish king. Anti-Semitism on full display. But this has been happening for years, and now you're seeing the result of that. And equally, to fight back, it's going to take time. It's not going to be an overnight change. And I know that's disheartening, and I know that's not what people want to hear, but we've got to be real. Unfortunately, we've seen that people aren't interested in reality. They go on what they heard last. And that is why it's so important to be speaking out and educating. Look, I do something called rucking, which is based on US military special forces training. You basically walk with a really heavy weight, strange hobby. But today I did that. I did 6.5 miles, and I intentionally wore a hat with the Israel flag on. Why? Because I'm not going to hide that I stand with Israel. I am not going to be cowed by that. And I get it. Look, it's scary. It is scary for a lot of people. I don't, and be sensible and don't put yourself at risk. But I refuse. I'm not in the wrong. Standing with Israel is not in the wrong. Standing up for anti-Semitism is not in the wrong. And at what point do we stop retreating? Canada, America, Britain are as much home to the Jewish community as anyone else, and we have to start fighting against the hate. And look, I will say this as somebody who works for a Christian organization, and Peter from Bridges of Peace is on the call. Please know that you have friends. Please know that you have friends that stand by you and are in this for the long haul. And look, the Jewish community is small globally. Like, we recognize that, and that's why you need to work with your friends to defeat this. And I was just at a rally at our local Holocaust center because somebody had vandalized it with graffiti. So there was a community gathering, and you had people from all backgrounds and all faiths together. But one of a Holocaust survivor spoke and said, how do you fight hate? Education, education, education. And that, I think that is so important. But how do we do that? By holding the events you're holding, by making sure your children and grandchildren understand the reality. You don't need to whitewash anything or pretend that it's this black and white situation, because the Middle East is complicated. My own views have evolved since 2007 when I went there first. But education is so important. And if you're Jewish, instill that sense of who they are is so important. A people who has done incredible things, absolutely incredible things. And since leaving slavery in Egypt has been hated for it, but still today the Jewish people live, the Jewish people thrive, and the Jewish people continue to change the world. And that is part of your story. I've been saying this for a long time. We have to tell Israel's story. We don't have to talk about the idea. We don't have to talk about cherry tomatoes. Israel's human story. What is happening on the ground in Israel? What is the reality? Because that is what we're losing. And Israel's story is so intertwined with the Jewish story. It's so important. So just to kind of round out here, and look, I wish I had more practical advice, more hopeful things to say. Like, it's been a very difficult 2 weeks just for me from a work perspective, so I can't imagine what it's been like for the Jewish community. We have to stand together. It's incumbent upon non-Jews to stand with the Jewish community now, because if we don't, we have no right to ever ask, how did the Holocaust happen? We have no right. If we don't stand with the Jewish community now, we have no right to ever speak out against any bigotry again, because we've failed. We failed in the past. We cannot fail the Jewish people this time. Secondly, education. Educate yourself, educate your friends. One of the things which has been hugely impactful for me is, like I said, I do this activity called rucking, and I have a huge circle of friends through that and a running community. So many of those people have spoken to me about the situation in Israel and about the rising anti-Semitism. Even people from my church. Just had a text message from our pastor actually while I was on this, because they know that they can speak to me. They know that I can give them more information, and that's important. It's not about talking to, look, maybe this is preaching to the choir a bit. Get it, totally get it. But there's so many other circles that you have that you can impact, and that is incredibly important. And I don't know if I'm on 3 or 4. Thirdly, learn. Like, it's a lot, but keep learning, keep evolving. And fourthly, we have to shut it down. If somebody makes an anti-Semitic comment as a joke, we challenge it. And sometimes it's more challenging, dealing with somebody at work or at a family dinner than a stranger online, but we have to. We have to make sure that every person who holds anti-Semitic views, who tries to dress anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism, has nowhere to hide. They need to be called out They need to know what they're doing is wrong, and we have to shine the light of truth on the darkness, which is Jew hatred. And that is all I have to say.
Thank you, Kasim. That's excellent. A lot of information there, but very pertinent to the times that we live in. It's for Bridges for Peace, and I know KUFI does a lot of this, but as an organization, we're a Christian organization bridging the gap between Christians and Jews. So a lot of education is a primary thing right from our creation as an organization in 1976. And Bridges for Peace comes definitely with I would say it starts as a very faith-based effort. So we reach into churches across the country. We're talking, and for a lot of the Christians we deal with, levels of education is certainly one to be addressed. What typically what we find is just a lot of people are kind of looking at both sides, or they're unfamiliar in a biblical sense. They're unfamiliar with God's role for Israel in Scripture and even in the future. But then even with modern Israel, there's so much in that. And so as an organization, we try to step into the gap on the Christian side to correct those things and to speak into those things, and address the anti-Semitism that still is within the global church. Some incredible things have happened, absolutely, in church history. Now you have tens of millions. I mean, I've heard different numbers, hundreds of millions or tens of millions of so-called Christian Zionists, or Christians that have broken away from replacement theology, the belief that God is, basically the Jews disobeyed because they didn't accept Jesus, so God has condemned them or cursed them and given it to the church, and the Jewish people as a whole are cursed. And there's different levels and extremes, of course, of replacement theology, but it's like what you're saying, the singling out of the Jewish people. And replacement theology comes with a theological hammer to that, saying, no, despite what Scripture says, we're going to change it because the Jews are these type of people and God doesn't like them anymore. And you have the rhetoric that becomes violent and things like this throughout history. And so today, in Christian circles, you may not have some of the radical violence that you see in the Muslim world, or even the former Soviet Union world and things like this, but you have the rhetoric. There's the anti-Semitic rhetoric that's kind of wrapped up with Christian paper, and even to the extent where now you see evangelical Christians and mainline Christians siding and becoming almost like spokespeople for like Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and these things. And so this is from a Christian perspective, these are things that are very troubling to us. But we also, Linda Sarsour came out here a few years ago and we stood against her and publicly and tried to do things. So there's so many layers to this. And I want to invite, we have about 12 minutes left. If anybody has questions, they can put them at the bottom. I'm going to just start it off with kind of probe Kasim with a question here to kind of unravel, to give you guys some time to put in some questions. And thank you once again, Kasim, for your lecture. Thank you, Yolanda, for partnering with Bridges for Peace, with Winnipeg Friends of Israel. So Kasim, we see anti-Semitism on the street. Okay, like I just explained to you before the event, just over a week ago, there was a Jewish woman at a hot dog stand here in Winnipeg who was surrounded by people who called her dirty Jew. So you have stuff like, and then you have your protests and your chants, death to the Jews, and protests. You have LA, thugs attacking Jewish men outside of a sushi bar. So you have things that are like very violent. They're very in your face, public. Then you have books, like you were saying, but then and that comes kind of two-sided. And I want you to talk a little bit into anti-Semitism, the serious problem of anti-Semitism in universities, and you touched on that a bit in your lecture, but then also your social media, how do people, and you just barely touched on this a little bit, but how do people who want to oppose this go into, how do we confront these types of areas where anti-Semitism just seems to be boiling over?
So college campuses have been a challenge for a few decades now, at least. I've spoken at a lot of college campuses, and there is sadly a lot of hostility. And again, look, there's no campus that I can tell you where there's been a BDS resolution, which there hasn't then been anti-Semitic violence soon before or after. Like we can't separate the two. And you've seen that especially in the Californian system right now. Um, Again, it's so challenging at universities because the very professors are pushing the anti-Israel narrative. They're pushing this anti-Semitic narrative, and it's so insane to me. I'll give you an example. So I live in Florida. The main campus near me is the University of South Florida, USF, a very well-known university. So they had a tenured professor who maybe a decade ago was there, and then he left to take on a new job. Do you want to know what his job that he was going to take over was? Head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Like, so that's the level of issues you have at campuses. Then when they get tenure, then they can say whatever, and there's very little you can do. So that is one of the major challenges. Two, I think that so many Jewish students and pro-Israel students just feel defeated. They feel like there's this wave of hate, and they don't want to be fighting back. And sometimes you have, unfortunately, the pro-Israel community trying to help really put their foot in it. What we need to do is empower students. Again, it comes down to education. We need to empower these students to be able to talk about the issues, to be confident in who they are. And look, I think, from a CUFI perspective, that's why we try and empower Christian students, because Jewish students can't do it alone. It's a lot. Look, for Christians who stand with Israel, who stand against anti-Semitism, we get to go home almost. For Jewish people, they live this 24/7, and that's why it's so important for us to stand with them. So it is about empowering the next generation, because instead of empowering the next generations, we've seen that be watered down. And people are afraid to say anything on college campuses because everything's offensive. Look, there's no the truth. Right is right. The truth is the truth. And if people don't want to hear it, that's fine. But you've got to keep speaking the truth, and we have to work to empower next generations. In terms of social media, it's just the very worst. It's a sewer where people can say whatever. There is no filter. It's just horrific. And look, you could be on social media arguing with people all day, and you get nowhere. And I think that's why it's so important. A number of things. You can report people for anti-Semitic comments, report them, get them taken off the platforms. I think that's one tool. The other is, instead of talking at people, talk to your group. If we have social media, use that to send a message, because look, it's fine you arguing with somebody on Times of Israel or an anti-Israel page. That's not going to have as much impact as you sharing something with your circle of friends when they are not getting the news or the stories, or they're hearing it from someone else. So I think that is hugely impactful. It's talking, instead of just talking into the noise, which is social media, because it is. It's just disgusting. And the people who are coming at you with anti-Semitism they're not there to talk. There are very few people who want to have a conversation, and they do exist, but the vast majority just want to come and spread their lies and be offensive and hurtful. And they then go back to their day job, whatever it is. But look, report comments, and if it's somebody who is stupid enough to have their profile open, take screenshots, make a note of where they work, and contact their employer. Like this guy at Google Diversity who wrote, the Jews are inclined to war. People found those comments he made on his blog, and he no longer is going to be working at Google. Like, this is important. There has to be real life consequences for what people do online. They can't say anti-Semitic things and bigoted things and think that it's fine, like it doesn't affect their real life.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question, and I think because you spoke about university students and students, I think I'm just wondering, I think many of them are actually afraid to comment online because many of the professors are anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. So I am not sure if they don't want to, or they're just afraid because it will affect their marks and and their ability to get into graduate school and so forth.
No, I totally understand. And that is sadly the challenge where you have students who, because their professor is anti-Israel, there are a real life issues for them if they voice their views. And it's unfortunate. And with students in that position, I would say your best bet is to make a note of what that professor is saying.
Yeah.
You know, there are organizations who can support campuses and students on campuses, and that student won't be singled out or be put in a position where their grades are going to be affected because some professor is incredibly petty. So I think in those situations, it's, you know, taking screenshots, making notes of what this professor says. And in those instances, especially when these are blatantly anti-Semitic comments, that's when the Jewish community leadership has to step up. That's when they have to go, okay, this is not okay. You would not allow this against any other community. Why is it okay on our community?
I don't see any questions.
Well, Yolanda, Inger, I saw raised a hand. Inger, if you're still on, if you have a question, you can type it in the Q&A box. It'll pop up and, okay, Victoria raised a hand. Are you able to type a comment, a question? If you could type your question in the Q&A box, I can easily pitch it to Kasim.
I can ask something in the meantime, Kasim. What do you?
Yes. Oh, here we go. Oh, that was a mistake. Okay.
What do you envision will happen in the next altercation or the next war between Hamas and Israel, or Hezbollah and Israel? I mean, it's something that if we learn from history, we should be able to sort of predict something for the future.
I think we're in for much of the same, to be honest. And that's why planning for, so Israel can look after itself. In terms of conflict, Israel thankfully can look after itself. But in terms of telling Israel's story, I think it has to start now. One of the challenges is, look, Hamas is a terrorist group. It is oppressing their own people. It is doing all these awful things, but we don't talk about that until they're firing rockets at Israel. So when that's happening, and then they're pulling out images of dead children, nobody cares that Hamas is a terrorist group. You've already lost. You're trying to now explain. We need to be constant in our messaging that Hezbollah is a terrorist group run by Iran. Hamas is a terrorist group, and this is what they're doing. We have to tell these stories now. Who is talking here's the thing. Who is now talking right now about the children in Sderot who are suffering from PTSD? Who's talking about the children in Sderot who have, you know, these toys which look like caterpillars, but they're bomb shelters? We need to be telling this story over and over again, because that's what the other side do. They just repeat this. They repeat the same lies over and over again, and people believe them. We're not telling the truth well enough. Like, honestly, that's what I believe. I feel that we're not telling the truth enough, and we have to tell Israel's human story. Every IDF soldier is someone's child who has to join the IDF because Israel's enemies are trying to destroy it. We don't talk about that. We will post a picture about, look, here's an IDF soldier in uniform. Nobody cares about that, unfortunately. In the world today, they see somebody in uniform with a gun. They don't see the human being behind it, and that's so important.
Two quick questions before we close. Isaac Willick said, saw the WFI, that's Winnipeg Friends of Israel, post about the Free Palestine lawn signs. Where are these being put up or distributed?
I think someone saw it. I guess I put it on Facebook. There is a Palestine. I think it was in Bridgewater here in one of the lawns, and I think somebody reported it to the police.
Okay.
I don't know if it's a crime, but this is something that they're, I guess, looking into doing too. I don't know. Maybe we should have lawn signs saying "Free Palestinians,
free Gaza from Hamas."
Yeah. Maybe that's what we have to do. Use the same methods that they use, unfortunately.
Well, we'll end with one last question quickly. Victoria asks, Kasim, how will the new coalition government in Israel affect worldwide anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Honestly, not at all. Israel could have a black Muslim prime minister. It wouldn't change. People are going to hate Israel simply for existing. And again, but again, it's important for us to tell this story. I mean, Israeli politics is unique in general, but you talk about an apartheid state doesn't make sense. Like, so I think in general, the people who are going to hate Israel are going to hate it as long as it exists. Like
Right.
that is just sadly the way it is. And this is why when people say, legitimate criticism of Israel isn't anti-Semitic, I agree, but your criticism isn't legitimate. What policy are you criticizing? You're criticizing the whole state and its very existence. But I think, again, these are important stories from on the ground in Israel that we have to share. And the power of asking questions is sometimes more powerful than answering, because people will shout apartheid. How is it apartheid? Like, tell me, like, define apartheid and explain to me.
Yeah.
And I've noticed on college campuses, that's how you see people kind of fall apart because that's all they know. They know buzzwords.
Yeah, I had one person say Israel breaks international law, and I said, well, which ones? I don't know, but they just do.
I mean,
Right?
but that again, it's terms like that. Like,
It's terms
how
like
many
that.
people genuinely know that international law isn't really a thing? It's a set
Right.
of codes, and it's not like a book of international law.
Right.
Like, it makes, and there's probably 8 people in the world who are international law experts. It's like, dude, you work at Timmy's, you don't know anything about international law. Like, stop. But that's it. Again, they have these buzzwords and somehow think it gives them influence and power.
Oh, well, thank you, Kasim. I just want to say as a close, first of all, a reminder, because I'm notorious for missing these things. On June 10th is going to be our next WFI BFP event. It's called Israel's Military Challenges, Achieving Military Goals While Maintaining a Code of Ethics and Humanity. And it's a webinar again with Amiram Jakara, who is the Israel Defense Attaché to Canada. And so they will be giving a presentation on the 10th. And then on June 24th, we have Michael Fiegelman with Honest Reporting, and he will be speaking. So the email that we sent out advertised all 3 of these lectures. So we hope to see you on the 10th. Once again, thank you, Kasim. I feel like CUFI, Christians United for Zion, or for Israel, Bridges for Peace, Winnipeg Friends of Israel, and many others. There is a movement across this nation and across the world of both Jewish and non-Jewish organizations that love Israel. And then you have a whole smattering of hundreds of millions of people in the middle looking at both sides with all the rhetoric, all the mainstream media, all the loud noise. And we got to somehow, rather than arguing for the rest of our lives with the hostile people, we have to not just be reactionary. We have to make this kind of a 24/7 and tell the real story of Israel, stand with the Jewish community, because like you said, like it's not just the Jewish community. We don't stand with them, we don't earn the right. It's also an assault on morality and ethics and all of these things. And we would be so naive and ignorant to think, oh, it'll only be with the Jewish community and end there. It will be with anybody who loves life, anybody who loves freedom, anybody who loves the morality, the ethics, a Judeo-Christian worldview, any of that. These are targets as well. So anti-Semitism may start with Jews, but it never just ends with Jewish people. It's a ripple effect, and there's more things to it. So we need to do what is right because it's right, and we need to stand against this hate, stand shoulder to shoulder. It's an honor to be with you, Kasim, honor to be with you, Yolanda. Thank you, everybody, for watching this and attending this lecture. God bless and shalom.
Thank you, Kasim. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Okay. Good night.